Let us go to the first puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: Queen takes knight, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to f3, check. Queen to f2, check. Queen to f1, check. Queen takes knight, check. The best move in puzzle position is c5. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. Another puzzle. The threats are: Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: Rook to h8, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen to h5, check. Queen to h4, check. Queen to f5, check. The best move in puzzle position is Queen to h5, check. Queen to h6. Queen takes pawn. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: there are no threats in this position. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to e8, check. Knight to d4, check. Knight to g1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight to g1, check. King to d2. Rook takes rook, check. Bishop takes rook. Promotes to queen. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are: Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in this position are: Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: Queen takes pawn, check. King to d2. Knight to c4, check. King to e2. Queen takes knight. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are: pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Checks in puzzle position are: Queen to h1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to h1, check. King to e2. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to f2. Pawn takes rook. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are: Rook takes rook. The checks are: Rook to d6, check. h5, check. Solution to the puzzle is: h5, check. King takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Let's continue. The threats are: Rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are: Rook to e7, check. Rook to f7, check. Solution to the puzzle is: Rook to f7, check. King to h6. g7, check. King to h7. Rook to h6, check. King takes rook. Promotes to queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: Bishop takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. The checks are: Queen to h5, check. The best move in puzzle position is: Queen to h5, check. King to g7. Knight takes pawn, check. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Checks in puzzle position are: Queen takes rook, check. Rook to e8, check. Answer to this puzzle is: Rook to e8, check. King to h7. Queen takes rook. Bishop to h3. Queen to g8, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are: Queen to g6, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to e5. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop to g7. Queen takes rook, check. Another puzzle. The threats are: Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes queen, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are: a2, check. Queen to e1, check. Queen takes queen, check. Queen to b2, check. Queen to a1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: a2, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to c2. Queen takes knight. Rook to g3. Queen to f4. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. b2, check. Answer to this puzzle is: Rook takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Rook to a1, check. King to b2. Rook takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook to d6 check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. h7. Rook to h4. Rook to g4 check. Rook takes rook. Promotes to queen check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn check. Solution to the puzzle is. Queen takes pawn check. King to f8. Queen to h8 check. King to e7. Queen takes pawn. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. King to g4. King to f2. h4. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. King to g2. King to g4. Next puzzle, the threats are. Queen takes rook check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to e7 check. Queen takes rook check. The best move in puzzle position is. Rook to b7. f6. Rook takes queen. Pawn takes queen. Rook to f7 check. King to e8. Rook takes bishop. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn check. Checks in this position are. Queen to h6 check. Rook takes pawn check. The puzzle is solved using. Queen to h6 check. King to f7. Queen takes pawn check. King to e8. Queen takes pawn check. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Rook takes pawn check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn check. g5 check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook to a5. Rook to g7. g5 check. King to h5. Rook takes rook. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn check. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn check. The checks are. Pawn takes pawn check. Rook to a7 check. Rook takes pawn check. The answer is. Pawn takes pawn check. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes pawn check. King to c7. Rook takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are. Bishop takes pawn check. Knight takes pawn check. Rook takes bishop. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn check. Queen to h2 check. Knight takes pawn check. Knight to d1 check. Rook to e2 check. Rook to f1 check. The answer is. Queen to h2 check. King takes rook. Bishop takes pawn check. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes queen check. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The answer is. Rook to b8. King to c1. d2 check. King to c2. Rook to b2 check. King takes bishop. Promotes to queen. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. The checks are. Bishop to g2 check. Solution to the puzzle is. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop to g2 check. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes rook check. Rook to g1. Queen takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook check. The checks are. Rook takes rook check. Solution to the puzzle is. b5. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes rook check. Next puzzle. The threats are. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes rook. The checks are. f6 check. Queen to g5 check. Queen to h6 check. The puzzle is solved using. Queen to g5 check. King to h8. Queen to f6 check. Rook to g7. Rook takes rook check. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Queen takes rook check. Queen takes pawn check. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. The answer is knight takes pawn. King takes knight. Queen takes rook. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.